ready to get started with the second half. Thank you very much. Thank you for staying. Thank you for not going away, being scared of me in the dark. Lots of people have been before now, and you won't be the last. I hope you've enjoyed having a little look at the model, those of you who have. It will still be there afterwards, so if you haven't had the opportunity or want to look at it again, or give it a whirl, because you can literally do that with care, do have a look. It's a work of art built out of Yorkshire stone, and it deserves more recognition than it has had. So I've already told you a little bit about High Sunderland, the house of which we have the model there, and I've referred to various aspects of its history. A little bit more of it now then. As I said, it appears to have been built back in the 15th century and then had big walls built around it to look a bit like a castle, battlements on the top, in the 1620s. And it was the ancestral home of the Sunderland family. Now I'm taking you now to an area just on the edge of Greater London, South Ockenden in Essex. This is an odd thing to do. But the family that lived at High Sunderland were the Sunderlands, down to the 17th century. And one of them married the daughter of a man whom this monument commemorates. And his name, interestingly, was Saltonstall. And Saltonstall, as many of you will know, is the name of a little settlement near the top of London, Dean, and his family originated there. But he as a boy went down to London, made his fortune, became Lord Mayor of London in 1598, and one of his daughters married back into a Yorkshire family and came to live here at High Sunderland. It's an extraordinary story, and we have this wonderful monument with all the Saltonstall children, and one of those girls at the bottom on the right must represent Mary, who came back to Halifax having married Richard Sunderland of High Sunderland. In Halifax Parish Church, now Halifax Minster, over many years, various elements have been lost, different shapes, different parts of the architecture, but mostly old monumental stones, either stones or tombstones, and one of those which was lost is the one we see on the right here. And it was sketched before 1620 by a man from Pontefract who we call an early antiquary, and he was a man who went around, his name was Dr. Johnston, and he did sort of recording of old records in churches, and he sketched some of these images, and had this image which was sketched along with various others which represent lost tomb covers and similar at Halifax Parish Church, had they not been included by the famous 18th century historian of Halifax in his work. Some of you will know of John Watson's History of Halifax, dated 1775, which took about 20 years to put together, and he used illustrations like this, and thankfully one of them shows a brother and a sister in the Sunderland family. So that's what was with their coat of arms, sadly no longer there today, probably lost before 1700, but we do have the picture. So there's the castellated front of High Sunderland, looking at a sort of oblique angle at that extraordinary gateway at the side, which really only appears to have led into a farmyard, which is quite extraordinary. You don't get many farmyards with gates like that, do you? And that, we think, was built either Richard or his son Abraham Sunderland. If you look at the back, and those of you who've had a look at the model will have seen a representation of this. These are, of course, authentic photos from the early 20th century. The main entrance up the back, up steps. And if you go around the side, and you can again see it in the model, there are more steps up to an upper floor. And as I understand it from people who told me about the house, there's not that many who can remember it now, but we believe that it didn't have an internal staircase latterly. Probably it would have done in its original form when it was a half-timbered structure, but we haven't any evidence of it. And if you look even at the back, where they built together two gables, they've even tried to put battlements on the top there. So there are various unusual aspects of the structure, including inscriptions. and there's what have been and what are coats of arms, and there's very strange phraseology, which I'm not going to go into now, but I do a talk about High Sunderland and another house, and in that I relate some of the humour of some of those inscriptions, which are all in Latin. So this is an interior wall painting, unfortunately another of those things which we seem to have lost completely. It's absolutely ridiculous that we've lost all these things, and it's pretty ridiculous that we lost High Sunderland itself. More about that later. Some of you may have seen in Shibden Hall, on one side of the dining room, if you've been privileged to have one of these sections of panelling, a bit like this, opened back, that there is in fact some wall painting there, which must have been very colourful in Tudor times. This is something similar, probably more elaborate. The image appears in a book which was published in 1906, and we have no trace of it since, but whether it was actually extant in 1906, I'm not clear. It could have been, but look at that beautiful painting, what that must have been like. So probably Tudor, and no sign of it today, but it was there probably in 1906 or earlier. So the Sunderlands who were living in the early 17th century at High Sunderland, they were very strict Puritans, very low church, keeping certain rules. Thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. But one of them, Abraham, he married into a very prominent royalist family. And they were the Langdale family from the East Riding near Beverley. And they were sort of borderline Catholics. It was a very unusual marriage. I can only think it might have been for love. Whether it was or not, Abraham Sunderland, who married this lady, he went into the royalist army and got shut up in the siege of Pontefract, the second siege of Pontefract Castle in 1645. And just before the siege was raised, he was shut in by the parliamentary army around with all his colleagues and commanders and so on. He was unfortunate enough to die just before it was relieved. This is Abraham Sunderland's son, and he had the unusual name of Langdale Sunderland from his mother's family. And his uncle was Marmaduke Langdale, who was the Colonel General, or one of the Colonels General of the King's Army. And he fought under his uncle at the Battle of Marston Moor in July 1644. He was very badly wounded. It wasn't absolutely clear whether he was going to survive, but he was taken back home to his wife's family, and in the 1650s, having been heavily fined by Parliament for fighting on the King's side, he decided to sell his properties in this area. And that's what he did. And that was the end of the Sunderlands up at High Sunderland. They also lived at Coley Hall near the home, as some of you may know. In Halifax Minster today, although these pictures were actually taken a few years ago now, there are one or two relics of the Sunderland family, but you have to have them pointed out to you. One of them is this wonderful coat of arms, which is the three lions, like the three lions of England. The three lions, though rather differently, divided down the middle, different colours each side. It's rather complicated. And there's a doorway, which is actually a late Victorian doorway, which is a doorway with the stone of which was originally the entry, we believe, going up steps to the rood loft above the screen in the church. But that was done away with, of course, the rood loft at the Reformation, and then came an upstairs gallery, and that gallery was called the Sunderland Loft. It was an upstairs pew. We have some images of it, but this is where they used to go through to get, they were posh people, so they had an upstairs pew they could overlook the people down below. That was all altered in the 1870s. The Langdale Sunderland, he sold his property, and it passed into various other families. It went to the Horton family after whom Horton Street is named in Halifax, the Walkers of Lightcliffe at one stage, and the Priestleys as well. They didn't live there, they let the property to tenants, and originally those tenants would have been families of some means, but gradually the property deteriorated. So from 1820s to 1860, High Sunderland was in the hand of William Priestley, who was important in Halifax history, as really the founder of the Halifax Choral Society. He was also a cousin of Anne Walker, of Anne Lister fame, and he knew both ladies well. But again, he didn't live there. Of the people who did live in High Sunderland, we do have some trace as tenants. In the mid-19th century, the house seems to have been divided into two. Later on, it appears to have been divided into four. But it was divided into two at the time when James Mills was living there, and he is commemorated on his tombstone, which was originally at Square Chapel, which we rescued and took to, with the help of the council, up to Lister Lane Cemetery to save it with a whole lot of others in 2015. And it clearly says James Mills of High Sunderland, so it's the stone which is now at Lister Lane Cemetery, not the remains of Mr. Mills. However, his son, who as far as we can tell, who had the very strange name of Thackwar Mills, he was married, as far as we can tell, from High Sunderland in 1833. And lived up there till after 1841, when he's commemorated in the census. And he's buried at Lister Lane with his wife and little son. During the early 1860s, the house at High Sunderland passed to Evan Charles Sutherland Walker. Those of you who know about Anne Walker and Anne Lister may recognise him as Anne Walker's nephew. But he passed it on to others. And as I mentioned earlier, there was this interlude when the area around the hall was used specifically as a farm by the Halifax Industrial Society. And an early socialist, you might almost call him, George Jacob Holyoake, was somebody who really commended the diligent work and how the co-op were doing their work up there and in Halifax in general. The property eventually was bought in the 1860s by a chap called Whiteley Ward, and he lived at a house called South Royd, which was the opposite side of the road below Manor Heath Park in Halifax, and there's a South Royd Avenue there to this day. No trace of the house, but the little, almost like a bird box, isn't it? That wonderful little clock tower is now, which was once over the stables at South Royd, is now fixed to the primary school of All Saints in Dugwell Lane. So Mr. Ward owned the property in the late 19th century, and he was a very wealthy industrialist. He had the Ellen Royd Mills sort of just the other side of North Bridge. He died eventually, having moved away from Halifax. He moved away to Elvington near the Derwent, and he's buried there under a huge monument which also commemorates his four daughters and eventually their housekeeper and her husband. Why I mention this is Whiteley Ward left the house at High Sunderland to his four daughters. Two of them didn't marry, two did, none of them had any children. So when the last of them died, she left it to their former housekeeper, who was Mrs. Holden, who had Halifax connections in her earlier years. She inherited it in the 1920s, didn't know quite what to do with it, and it was going downhill really badly. By the 1940s, during the Second World War, it was still occupied, as far as I can gather, divided into two sections, possibly more, and I was speaking to a lady about 3 months ago who believes that her mother was the last child born in the old house in about 1930. Be that as it may, I'm sure it was accurate story. So this is the house as it had deteriorated after the Second World War, after all the tenants had moved out. It began to be vandalised. It was in a poor state. They had running water of sorts. They had no electricity. So you can imagine what it was like living there in the 20s, 30s and 40s. Very primitive. The walls of the house, as we shall see in a moment, began to bow outwards. This was possibly the result of some diggings around, not so much connected with the farming, but there had also been some diggings for stone and coal in the area too. And in due course, attempts were made to sell this wonderful old house from 1948 when Mrs. Holden died. Her widower took on the ownership. He tried to sell it, first of all, to the Halifax Corporation, and secondly to the Brontë Society. Neither of them had the money to do anything with it and were reluctant even to put out the money to save it. As a result, a man living at Queensbury with the stone firm up at Queensbury took on the responsibility for its demolition, and then he was able to use the stone for other purposes. And you can see here, when they were doing the demolition in 1950, they came across a kind of secret spiral staircase which hadn't been known about, which must have dated probably from the 1620s-ish. So little things come to light, and here we see the house. And if you look at the situation of those naked men standing on those pillars, you can see what's happening to the walls even before it's demolished, can't you? It's beginning to give way. But that picture is interesting because we can see behind part of the gable, because some of the wall has already been demolished. And this is what happened. And by 1951, there was nothing left but a few stones. However, as I shall show you in a few moments, there are a few traces even today. If you were to look on Google, you would see something like this. And it does actually mark High Sunderland Hall as an object, so you might be able to find it easily. It's at a bend on High Sunderland Lane, between Turner Lane on one side and the old Bradford Road on the other side. High up there, and you might say almost completely forgotten, unless we're talking about it today and anybody who's interested in local history. The few relics which remain of High Sunderland, which are identifiable and of interest, are these. This was taken a few years ago. These are out behind the back of Shibden Hall, in the area we normally call the West Riding Folk Museum, in that courtyard where there's the old little shops and things round there. And they have been organised a bit better than when I took these pictures. These are a few relics. When the hall was demolished, a chap called Nicholson, who had a local firm, he saved various sections, and these are clearly identifiable from the old paintings, the old illuminations, the old photos and things. We have the coat of arms of the Sunderland family, and one of those naked figures, various other bits and pieces. So they are still there today. We have a few relics of High Sunderland Hall, and now I'm sure you're heartily sick of High Sunderland Hall, and we'll move on to a Southowram inspiration for Heathcliff. See what we think of this. Heathcliff, often regarded as an archetype of the tortured anti-hero, whose all-consuming rage, jealousy and anger corrupt and destroy both himself and those around him. You can tell I didn't write that myself, can't you, that language? So he took over property. Basically what he was doing, he took over property which was not his right. He moved the rightful heirs out of position, and he stepped in and took it over. That's basically what we remember, I think. I'm not talking much about characters, as you'll gather from Wuthering Heights. So Law Hill House, I'm delighted to see Nikki Darby here tonight, who lives at Law Hill House, and who I met before when we had the unveiling of the plaque to Emily Brontë, Halifax Civic Trust, back in 2018. So there's a character who might fit Heathcliff in a sense, who lived at Law Hill House and who actually built it. This is the theory, not of myself, but of others who've gone before me. So, we owe the record of the story of Jack Sharp to a diarist. When I've been here before, I've spoken quite extensively about a diarist who lived here at Holdsworth House. And she was, of course, not the same one. And she wasn't Anne Lister either. There were 3 lady diarists living in Halifax in the early 19th century. Anne Lister, of course, is the preeminent one. We also have Elizabeth Wadsworth, who lived here at Holdsworth House. And we have Caroline Walker, or Caroline Wyville Walker, who lived at the old house up in Southowram, which was called Walter Clough, sometimes one word, sometimes 2 words. She wrote a history of her family and also kept a diary, parts of which have been printed, and she was baptised in Halifax in 1774. This is part of the old house she would have known. It's gone now, up at Walter Clough, not too far to the east of Law Hill. and the 17th century section with mullioned windows, as you will see. Again, we come back to that early 19th century sketcher of Halifax buildings, Arthur Comfort. Now, Caroline was partly educated at the Manor School at York, which was the same place to which Anne Lister would go about 17 years later, and where Elizabeth Wadsworth also attended earlier. She also travelled around a bit, did Caroline Walker. She was somebody who thought she was something, and you know what that means. It means you can get delusions of who you are, and you can want to move in certain circles. I think Anne Lister succeeded at that, don't you? But Caroline Walker was not quite so successful. She would be transported back and forth to London for her finishing education after she had been to the Manor School at York. So she went to quite an elite women's academy, whatever you call it, in London, and she travelled back and forth in the local area anyway by the York High Flyer coach. Any of you who've read about Anne Lister will know about the High Flyer coach. Now, I said Caroline Walker had a bit of a delusion of grandeur. Shall we say she set her cap at a member of the aristocracy who came to Halifax and stayed at Southowram while he was doing something military in the area. We don't seem to have any images of him. I haven't found one, but his name was Lord Evelyn Stewart. He was a sort of a soldier anyway, who was recruiting in the Halifax area and based up at Banktop near Southowram. And Caroline thought, this is the daughter of a marquis. If I could get him to marry me, I'd be a real lady. Unfortunately, it didn't work. He came back and forth to Halifax several times, and she says in her diary about her attempts to woo him, they didn't quite come off. We have these relics of his sword. He was the son, a younger son of the Marquis of Bute. Caroline Walker, about who I'm talking, who kept this diary and who lived at Walter Club, we know she was acquainted with Anne Lister, and there's an account which tells us that they were once present at a certain performance or concert in Southowram St Anne Church. This is really a pedigree of the Walkers. I won't go into the details, but I will point out one or two things. And ideally, probably I should have had copies of this with me tonight, but I didn't quite get round to it. We have Walter Clough Hall, we have the descent, but just move across here for a moment, the descent of the Walker family. John Walker of Walter Clough, who died in 1768. John Walker Jr. died in 1828. His eldest daughter was Caroline Walker, the diarist. She had one brother who died unmarried and various sisters. John Walker Jr. had a sister Grace, who was the mother of Samuel Stead. John Walker Sr. had a nephew who was called Jack Sharp, descended from the Walker family through the female line. And this is where the connections come in. You don't need to remember all of that. Just listen to what I say and go to sleep. It's easier. So there was a marriage of Anne Annicle and the Walkers of Walter Clough, Halifax Parish Church in 1727. The Reverend Abraham Sharp, who was a member of the Sharp family who lived around Coley in particular, was married there in 1727, and this is the monument to his father, which is in Coley Church today. And he was the grandfather of the Jack Sharp about whom I'm going to speak. So we have Reverend Nathan Sharp, we have Abraham Sharp, and then we have John or Jack Sharp. And this is the baptism which took place at